War has a grim sense of humor, and it usually involves the collision of delusion with reality. In the history of warfare, there are countless stories of brave last stands, of commanders who drew a line in the sand and held it against impossible odds. We remember Thermopylae, we remember the Alamo. But for every legendary last stand that echoes through history, there are dozens of others that ended not in glory, but in sudden, catastrophic violence, because a commander mistook the patience of his enemy for weakness. In September 1944, in the mud and stone of eastern France, a German major made a fatal miscalculation. He believed he was the protagonist in a Wagnerian opera, a hero destined to hold a fortress against the barbarian hordes. He believed that his defiance would buy time, inspire his nation, and grant him a warrior's immortality. He looked at the American lines, commanded by General George S. Patton, and issued a challenge that sounded like something out of a medieval chronicle. He said, "If you want this fortress, you will have to kill me to get it." He thought he was starting a negotiation, or perhaps initiating a glorious, weeks-long siege that would write his name in iron. He didn't realize that he was speaking to a man who viewed war not as a duel of honor, but as an industrial process of elimination. Patton didn't see a hero. He saw a logistical obstacle. And when told that the German commander required death as a prerequisite for surrender, Patton didn't get angry. He simply checked his watch and said, "I can arrange that." What followed was not a battle. It was a 12-hour lesson in the difference between bravery and suicide. To understand why this specific engagement became a masterclass in annihilation, we must look at the landscape of September 1944. The Third Army was racing across France, a mechanized shark that had smelled blood. The breakout from Normandy was over, and the pursuit was on. But the Allied supply lines were stretched to their breaking point. Fuel was low, ammunition was rationed, and every delay on the road meant the German army had more time to regroup at the German border. Speed was not just a tactical preference for Patton, it was a strategic necessity. In the middle of this frantic race sat an obstacle that could not be ignored. It was a fortress, a relic of a previous century's wars, likely upgraded by French engineers in the Maginot era, and now occupied by the Wehrmacht. It dominated a critical road junction. To bypass it meant diverting fuel trucks and tank transporters onto muddy, winding back roads, costing hours the Third Army didn't have. To take it by force meant stopping the advance and pivoting combat power. It was a stone bone stuck in the throat of the American advance. The fortress itself was a formidable piece of military architecture. Sited on high ground, it possessed thick stone walls, capable of shrugging off tank fire and light mortars. Its approaches were steep, open kill zones covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Beneath the stone and earth lay a network of bunkers and tunnels, protecting the garrison from the casual harassment of artillery. Inside, the German garrison was a mixed bag, typical of the Wehrmacht in late 1944. There were roughly 1,500 men. Some were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men with hollow eyes who knew how to kill. Others were terrified conscripts, old men and teenagers thrown into uniforms that didn't fit. But holding them together was a corps of officers led by a major who was a true believer. He was the type of officer who had internalized the propaganda of the Reich, believing that will alone could stop steel. He looked at the thick walls of his fortress and convinced himself that he was invincible, or at least irreplaceable. Patton, contrary to his nickname, Old Blood and Guts, was not a commander who wasted lives unnecessarily. He was aggressive, yes, but he was also a student of history. He knew that assaulting a fortress head-on was a fool's game that filled grave registration forms. His preference was always maneuver. Go around, cut them off, let them wither. But the road network didn't allow for a simple bypass. The fortress had to be neutralized. However, Patton also knew the war was ending. He knew the German army was breaking. He reasoned that many of the men inside those walls had no desire to die for a lost cause in a stone box in France. So he chose the path of efficiency. He sent an officer forward under a white flag of truce. The scene that played out at the fortress gate was a study in contrasts. The American envoy arrived in a jeep, dusty, pragmatic, carrying a simple, typed message. The terms were standard Geneva Convention protocols. Surrender the garrison, lay down your arms, and you will be treated with dignity. You will be fed, given medical care, and sent to the rear to sit out the rest of the war. There was no humiliation in the offer. It was a business transaction. Your position is hopeless. Our firepower is overwhelming. Let's save everyone the trouble. The German response, however, was pure theater. The major refused to even consider the tactical reality. He didn't look at the map, he looked in the mirror. He reportedly stood stiffly, adjusting his iron cross, and delivered his rejection with the gravity of a man reciting Shakespeare. He spoke of oaths, of sacred German soil, of duty, and then came the line that sealed his fate. He looked the American envoy in the eye and issued his dare. Tell General Patton that if he wants this fortress, he'll have to kill me to get it. When the envoy returned to the American lines, the staff officers were tense. They knew Patton's temper. They expected an explosion of profanity, a rant about the stubbornness of the Hun, perhaps a rash order to charge the walls just to prove a point. They braced themselves for the general's fury. But the fury never came. Patton listened to the report in silence. He asked the envoy to repeat the major's exact words. "He'll have to kill me to get it." Patton nodded, almost thoughtfully. To him, this wasn't an insult. It was a contract. The major had set the price of the real estate. He wasn't negotiating for safety or honor. He was negotiating the terms of his own mortality. Patton's response, "I can arrange that," was delivered with a chilling lack of emotion. It was the voice of a man confirming a dinner reservation. He turned to his operations officer and said, "The major says we have to kill him. Let's not disappoint him." This is the moment where the story shifts from a conventional military engagement to a systematic execution. Patton didn't order a charge. He didn't send infantry rushing up the slopes to die in the machine gun fire. Instead, he treated the fortress like a demolition project. He ordered a complete hermetic seal around the position. Sherman tanks and tank destroyers moved into hull-down positions covering every exit. Infantry dug in, not to attack, but to ensure that not a single rat could crawl out of the fortress. The water supply was located and cut. The electricity was severed. The German garrison was isolated from the world, cut off from Berlin, cut off from help, cut off from hope. But this was just the setting of the stage. The main event was the firepower. Patton ordered the heavy artillery brought forward. We aren't talking about light field guns or mortars. He called for the 155mm long toms and the 8-inch howitzers, massive weapons designed to crack concrete and pulverize stone. He ordered them to register their targets with mathematical precision. The gunners didn't just aim at the fortress. They aimed at specific coordinates: the command bunker, the ventilation shafts, the ammunition dump, the main gates. Simultaneously, the call went out to the 19th Tactical Air Command. The skies cleared, and the P-47 Thunderbolts arrived. These weren't high-altitude bombers dropping payloads vaguely on a city. These were fighter bombers, flying low and slow, pilots who could put a 500-pound bomb through a window. They circled overhead like vultures, their engines a constant, droning reminder of the violence to come. But the most devastating weapon Patton deployed that evening wasn't explosive. It was psychological. He ordered the psychological warfare units to bring up truck-mounted loudspeaker systems. These massive speakers were positioned just outside the range of German small arms, pointed directly at the stone walls. As the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows over the French countryside, the speakers clicked to life. The message they broadcast was not a plea. It was a schedule. The voice, booming in clear German, didn't ask the major to reconsider. It spoke directly to the 1,500 men trapped inside. It told them, with terrifying calmness, exactly what was going to happen to them. "Soldiers of the garrison," the voice boomed, "your commander has refused to surrender. He has demanded that we kill him. We are going to oblige him, but you do not have to die with him." The loudspeakers then read out the timeline. At 0600 hours, the artillery bombardment will begin. It will last for 2 hours. At 0800 hours, the air attacks will commence. We will target the command post and the barracks. At 1000 hours, we will assault. Anyone remaining in resistance will be destroyed. It was a masterstroke of psychological terror. Most battles are chaotic. Soldiers don't know when death is coming. Patton gave them an appointment. He let them sit in the dark, watching the hands of their watches tick closer to the promised hour. Inside the fortress, the atmosphere began to curdle. The major tried to maintain discipline. He walked the ramparts, checking the machine gun nests, giving rousing speeches about the glory of the fatherland. But he was fighting a losing battle against the silence of the night and the voice from the loudspeakers. The soldiers looked at the stone walls, which suddenly seemed very thin. They looked at the sky, knowing the American planes owned it completely. They looked at their major, and they didn't see a hero anymore. They saw a madman who had signed their death warrants to satisfy his own ego. The major had promised them a battle. Patton was promising them a slaughter. The psychological pressure was immense. Small groups of German soldiers began to whisper in the dark corners of the bunkers. Why should they die because one man wanted to make a point? The major, sensing the fracturing morale, issued orders that anyone attempting to surrender or discussing surrender would be shot on sight. He turned his guns inward. The fortress became a prison, not a defensive position. The men were trapped between the unstoppable American machine outside and the fanatical tyranny of their commander inside. The night dragged on, hour by agonizing hour. The Americans didn't fire a shot. They let the silence do the work. They let the imagination of 1,500 men fill in the blanks of what a 155mm shell does to a human body in a confined space. Patton was letting the major's own words strangle him. As dawn approached, the American gun crews stood by their weapons. The pilots sat in their cockpits, engines warming up. The infantry checked their rifles and fixed bayonets. There was no excitement, no nervous energy of a desperate fight. It was the routine preparation of a shift change at a factory. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and red. Inside the fortress, eyes were glued to watches. 0558, 0559. The major stood in his command post, arguably realizing for the first time that his bluff hadn't just been called, it had been crushed. He had asked for death, and the delivery system was locked, loaded, and checking the time. At exactly 0600, the horizon lit up. The first shell did not just strike the fortress, it announced the end of an era. At exactly 0600 hours, the silence of the French countryside was shattered by the simultaneous roar of dozens of heavy artillery pieces. The American gunners, working with the cold precision of assembly line workers, began the systematic deconstruction of the German position. This was not the chaotic, random drumfire of World War I, where shells churned up mud in a blind fury. This was surgical violence. The 155mm and 8-inch shells slammed into the ancient stone walls at precise intervals, targeting the structural weak points identified by reconnaissance photos days earlier. The stone, which had stood for centuries against muskets and primitive cannons, disintegrated under the impact of modern high explosives. Great clouds of pulverized rock and dust rose into the morning air, choking the defenders and turning the interior of the fortress into a gray, blinding hell. Inside, the German garrison learned the first lesson of Patton's curriculum. Stone walls are a trap, not a shield, when facing heavy artillery. The impact of the shells didn't just breach the perimeter.
The concussive force killed men inside bunkers without ever touching them, rupturing organs and shattering eardrums. The German artillery crews, desperate to follow their major's orders, attempted to return fire. They rushed to their guns, cranking the elevation wheels, trying to sight in on the American flashes in the distance. They fired a handful of rounds. It was a fatal mistake. American forward observers and counter-battery radar units had been waiting for exactly this moment. Within minutes of the first German muzzle flash, a torrent of American steel rained down on their positions. The German guns were silenced, twisted into scrap metal, their crews dead before the echo of their own shots had faded. By 07:45, the artillery shifted its aim.
It stopped pounding the walls and began walking the barrage through the interior of the fortress, sweeping the courtyards and suppressing any movement. The dust cloud was now hundreds of feet high, a tombstone marking the location of the Major's last stand. And then, cutting through the thunder of the guns, came a new sound. It started as a low drone in the west and grew into a terrifying scream. It was 0800 hours. The artillery ceased fire abruptly, leaving a ringing silence that lasted only seconds before the P-47 Thunderbolts arrived. The air attack was the death knell for the Major's command and control. The pilots had been briefed on specific targets. They didn't waste bombs on the perimeter. They went for the heart. They dove on the central complex, the location of the headquarters and the ammunition dumps. The Major, huddled in his command bunker, felt the earth heave as 500-pound bombs slammed into the structures above him. The ammunition storage took a direct hit. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic, a fireball that rose higher than the fortress walls, raining burning debris down on the terrified defenders. The psychological impact was absolute. The soldiers on the ground looked up and saw American planes circling with impunity, dipping their wings, taking their time to line up runs. There was not a single Luftwaffe plane in the sky to protect them. They were alone. It was in this chaos that the Major's authority began to disintegrate. He tried to rally his men, screaming orders over field telephones that had long since been severed by shrapnel. He ran through the ruined corridors, pistol in hand, threatening to execute anyone who wasn't fighting. But he was commanding ghosts. The men weren't listening to him anymore. They were listening to the loudspeakers. Through the smoke and the screams of the wounded, the American psychological warfare units continued to broadcast. "The artillery has finished," the voice announced calmly. "The air attack is concluding. You have 1 hour before the ground assault. Look around you. Your walls are broken. Your guns are destroyed. Your commander has lied to you. Come out now, and you will live." The logic of the loudspeakers was undeniable. The soldiers saw the bodies of their comrades, the ruined guns, the burning supplies. They realized that their Major wasn't a tactical genius. He was a man committing suicide and demanding they join him. The defections began as a trickle, a soldier here, a pair there, slipping away from their posts, dropping their rifles, and crawling through the breaches in the walls with their hands clasped behind their heads. The Major, seeing his army dissolve, reportedly shot at his own retreating men, screaming, "Traitors!" into the dust. But every shot he fired at his own troops only accelerated the collapse. He was no longer the defender of the fortress. He was just another enemy to be survived. At 1,000 hours, the ground assault began. It was anticlimactic by design. There was no wave of screaming infantry charging into machine gun fire. Instead, Sherman tanks rolled up to the breaches, their main guns traversing slowly, blasting any bunker that showed signs of resistance. American infantry moved behind the armor, methodical and professional, clearing the fortress section by section. They encountered pockets of resistance, die-hard loyalists or terrified kids who didn't know how to surrender. but these were neutralized with flamethrowers and grenades. The bulk of the garrison, however, had had enough. They emerged from the cellars and the rubble in droves, hands high, eyes wide with the shock of the bombardment. They walked past the burning wreckage of their positions, past the American tanks, and into captivity. They had chosen life. The final act played out in the ruins of the command post. The Americans moved cautiously toward the center of the fortress, guided by surrendering Germans who pointed out where the major was hiding. They found the entrance to his bunker blocked by debris but accessible. A squad of GIs, led by a weary sergeant, approached the door. They didn't storm in with guns blazing. They called out, offering one final chance to surrender. "Come out, Major. It's over." From the darkness of the bunker, there was a shout of defiance, something about honor and the Third Reich. Then, the Major stepped into the light. He was covered in dust, his uniform torn, his face a mask of fanatical exhaustion. He raised his Luger, leveling it at the Americans. It was a gesture of supreme theatricality. He wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. He wanted to force them to kill him in a shootout. He wanted his death to be a scene from an epic. The American sergeant didn't play along. He didn't give a speech. He didn't duel. He simply reacted to the threat. He raised his M1 Garand and fired 2 shots. The Major crumpled to the floor, dead before he hit the ground. There were no final words, no cinematic fade to black, just a body in the dust of a ruined bunker. The handful of staff officers remaining in the room immediately dropped their weapons and raised their hands. They looked at the dead body of their commander, then at the Americans. The spell was broken. The Major had promised that Patton would have to kill him to take the fortress. Patton had obliged. The transaction was complete. The entire operation, from the first artillery round to the death of the Major, had taken less than 12 hours. The American casualties were negligible, a handful of walking wounded, mostly from tripping in the rubble. The German casualties were severe. Over 200 dead, 300 wounded, and 1,000 prisoners. The fortress, which the Major claimed would hold for weeks, was secured before lunch. The next day, General Patton arrived to inspect the prize. He walked through the shattered gates, his boots crunching on the broken stone. He looked at the devastation his orders had wrought with a critical, professional eye. He didn't gloat. He didn't stand over the body of the Major and offer a witty one-liner. According to his aides, he was solemn. He walked past the lines of German prisoners, noting their condition. He visited the makeshift field hospital where American medics were treating wounded German soldiers side by side with their own. He stopped to ensure the prisoners were getting water and rations. This was the duality of Patton that terrified his enemies. He could order the absolute, ruthless destruction of a target one minute and demand the strict adherence to the laws of war the next. He had killed the Major because the Major insisted on it. He saved the Major's men because the war was over for them. "The Major said we'd have to kill him," Patton reportedly remarked to a colonel as they surveyed the ruined command bunker. "We did. It's a pity he had to take 200 of his own men with him to prove a point." The story of the fortress did not stay in eastern France. It traveled like a shock wave through the Wehrmacht. American intelligence officers, interrogating prisoners weeks later, began to hear the same story repeated. German commanders whispered about the Patton method. They told each other that if you surrendered to the Third Army, you would be treated correctly. But if you issued a challenge, if you tried to make a dramatic stand, Patton wouldn't play your game. He would simply erase you. The Major's death became a cautionary tale. It stripped the romance out of the last stand. It taught the Germans that their defiance didn't make them heroes in the eyes of the Americans. It just made them targets for a devastatingly efficient weapons system. In the weeks that followed, other German garrisons found themselves surrounded. Other commanders received the white flag ultimatum, and many of them, remembering the story of the fortress, looked at their own stone walls, looked at the photos of their families back home, and made a different choice. They marched out. They surrendered. They lived. The legacy of that 12-hour battle is a brutal lesson in the arithmetic of war. The major believed that his death would have meaning. He believed his sacrifice would delay the American advance or inspire his nation. In reality, his death bought the German army nothing. The convoy trucks were rolling through the road junction by nightfall. The war moved on, indifferent to his gesture. He had treated war as a stage for his ego, forgetting that his opponent treated war as a job. There is a terrifying clarity in Patton's response. "I can arrange that." It strips away the rhetoric of conflict and reveals the cold mechanics underneath. When you tell a man like George Patton that the only way he can achieve his objective is to destroy you, you are not issuing a threat. You are giving him permission. You are simplifying his tactical problem. You are removing the moral burden of your survival from his shoulders. The German major wanted to be a martyr. Patton granted his wish with such overwhelming force that it rendered the martyrdom meaningless. In the end, the major got exactly what he asked for, but at a price that only his men had to pay.